Hello, welcome everybody to this event. My name is Emily Zayden and I'm the director of the Craft in America Center in Los Angeles. And the talk that we're hosting today is held in conjunction with two exhibitions that we have focusing on the Unomi as a form, The Humble Legacy and Here Now. And those are both viewable, visitable from wherever you are in the world on our website, craftinamerica.org. We encourage you to see all the materials that we've gathered for these shows, which are virtual, and we hope at some point in the coming months to be able to open up to visitors. The shows have been extended to January 2nd. And today's talk by Chiaki Ajioka is a great pleasure for us to be hosting. Chiaki actually came and did research with our library materials here at the center many years ago now, going back probably about 8 years, I believe. And this has been a labor for over a decade for her in terms of researching the origins of Mingei and its transmission internationally. Chiaki's based in Australia, so good morning to you this very, very early morning wake up call. We're so pleased to have you here. We know we do have people attending from all over the world, and we hope many of you will share in the chat where you're joining us from today, various countries. We'd love to know. Just before Chiaki starts her talk, which will be undoubtedly very valuable for all of us to hear, I would invite everybody as Chiaki is speaking to add questions for her to address after she finishes in the chat or Q&A. Please put those questions in there and then we will review those questions and I will address those to her when she concludes. So we'll be monitoring those throughout her talk. So with that, I will pass over to you, Chiaki. Thank you so much for joining us. We're incredibly excited to hear your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, and for your kind introduction and also inviting me to talk today. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to share my research on global Mingei. First, I should explain what I mean by global Mingei. I call my current research on global Mingei for two reasons. First one is because I began with a question, what does Mingei mean outside Japan? I wrote my PhD thesis on the so-called Mingei movement in the context of modern Japanese craft. So I had a very good idea of what Mingei means in Japan. But living in Australia and during my visit to the United States, I found so much more freer and often very personal use of the word Mingei. On the other hand, I've also heard some Japanese people say, oh, the foreigner's idea of Mingei is not quite right. So what then would the right Mingei be? In Japan, Mingei is almost always associated with Yanagi Soetsu, his numerous writings on Mingei and the objects he collected and are displayed at the Japan Folk Crafts Museum in Tokyo, or Mingeikan. Outside Japan, however, access to Yanagi's writings is very limited and is often second-hand. People give their own definitions of Mingei, and I'm just showing the screen now. Okay. So this exhibition in 2009 in Australia of pottery, textile, and woodwork by 3 artists was titled Mingei, a way of working, a way of living. In this instance, Mingei is a philosophy that supports the craft maker's approach to his or her work and life. Hence my question, what does Mingei mean outside Japan? The second reason for naming my research Global Mingei is that as I started examining how it all began, I realized that from the very outset, Mingei as a concept was intercultural. The concept has its origins in the 1910s in the taste and appreciation of folk objects that was shared among several individuals connected across Japan, Britain, and the United States. I'll come back to the point later. About a decade later, in the mid-1920s, the word Mingei was coined by three Japanese, Yanagi and his potter friends Hamada Shoji and Kawai Kanjiro, to mean craft with the characteristics of people. From that time, Yanagi defended and wrote about Mingei extensively. They coined the word Mingei because there was no existing term to match the subject. But in this English-speaking world, Mingei largely overlaps with folk art, and the two are often used interchangeably. Yanagi, when communicating in English, used the words crafts and also peasant painting for a particular group of works. Another consideration in the Western world is the continuing and widespread legacy of the arts and crafts tradition, which relates to both style and approach to making. As a number of people have pointed out over the decades, arts and crafts principles also overlap with those of Mingei. In fact, often individual craft makers inherited both arts and craft and Mingei. So we cannot take instances in which the word Mingei is used and check it against Yanagi's definition. Even if such an exercise were possible, the result would not tell us what Mingei means outside Japan. At the same time, trying to examine each of the seemingly endless interpretations of Mingei to find a common thread that is not arts and crafts would also be impossible. But because ideas are formed in people's minds, I decided to trace correlated ideas among the individuals involved in the original Mingei. Conversations that took place decades ago are gone, of course, but their evidence can be found in private or published writings. As a result, I was able to identify individuals who formed what I call the Mingei network. Starting in Japan around 1910, those people met one by one, exchanged and discussed their common aesthetic, and gradually formed a communication link across the three countries. I also found the ways they cooperated in their efforts to promote the idea through exhibitions and publications. The 5 names under the maps were the protagonists in terms of active involvement in those activities. On the right hand, Tomimoto and Kawai in Japan were their close associates, but they are less active. Kawai did not travel to the West, and neither did Tomimoto after 1910, although exhibitions of their works were organized by others. I added Eric Gill and Ananda Kumaraswamy as their close associates. Gill was a direct descendant, as it were, of arts and crafts tradition in Britain. Leach and Hamada visited him in Ditchling in the early years of Leach pottery, and Yanagi also met him in 1929 with them. The letters of Leach, Bergen, and Yanagi reveal that they discussed Gill's art and ideas deeply. Langdon Warner quoted Gill when he presented the Pacific Cultures exhibition, which I'll talk about later. Kumaraswamy was another defender of folk arts. Gill and Kumaraswamy also had direct links to each other through their aesthetic concepts. Kumaraswamy worked at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and contributed essays to Warner's magazine, Eastern Arts. Two things are important about this Mingei network. First, there was no central authority, so to speak. And second, the key person who held this network together was Bernard Leach. So I'd like to talk a little about Leach, particularly about his activities in Japan, which are not widely known but are relevant to this talk. As you know, Leach was born in Hong Kong as the son of a lawyer. His mother died soon after she had him, so he was sent to spend some years with his grandparents who were in Japan. When his father remarried, he was returned to Hong Kong as a 3-year-old. His father then became a colonial judge in Singapore, so the family moved there. When he was 10 years old, he was sent to England to be educated. His father wanted him to be a banker, so Leach obeyed his father's wish, but he aspired to be an artist, and when his father's legacy came to him, he left the bank. It was his meeting with a Japanese student at the art school in London that he stirred his desire to go back to Japan. This student was Takamura Kotaro, sculptor and poet, the eldest son of Takamura Koun, who was a professor of sculpture at Japan's first national art school in Tokyo. Kotaro studied at the school where his talent was noticed by a professor of art history who persuaded his father to send him overseas to study. After his return to Japan, he became one of the most influential figures in the Japanese modern art movement. So Takamura was well connected to the Tokyo art world. He wrote introduction letters for Leach, and when Leach arrived in Japan in 1909, these letters connected the young English artist to the highest level of art professionals. Indeed, his arrival timed perfectly with the rise of the modern art movement in Japan. Leach took with him a printing press intending to teach etching. Copper plate printing was not new in Japan, but some came to learn etching from him. They were part of a group of young men from privileged families and educated at the Peers School, some of whom had studied in the West and were well informed on Western art. Leach quickly recognized that he had a lot to learn from his newly acquired English-speaking Japanese friends, and they in turn saw Leach as a living source of information on Western culture and art. Leach was one of the few Westerners who truly appreciated the inherent necessity of modernism in Japanese art, rather than seeing it as derivative of Western modernism. And it was Leach's lack of superiority, which was common among Westerners, that made those young artists and writers embrace him as one of their own. Before long, Leach joined in the rebellion against existing Japanese art establishments. I'd like to give a less well-known example of his friends. u.s.a was one of the most important modernist painters in Japan. Kishida and Leach were among the group of artists in the anti-government salon movement. They became good friends and they respected each other's art. About a month before his departure to Britain, Leach visited Kishida in his house outside Tokyo. He took the train and Kishida met him at the station. They first went over to visit another artist called Tsubaki, who was close to Kishida. At Tsubaki's house, they saw and discussed his work. Then all three went to Kishida's house, and Kishida wrote in his diary, I quote, "We had so much to talk about. In the evening, the three of us played sumo wrestling. Leach was pretty strong. It is so sad to think that I will not be able to see him for a long time. We listened to music on records. We talked till 11 o'clock. Tsubaki went home. Leach slept upstairs and I slept downstairs with family. I wish Leach every happiness in future," unquote. Among the the young artist Tomimoto Kenkichi became a particularly significant friend of Leach. Tomimoto graduated National Art School in architecture. He was an admirer of William Morris, and he went to London in 1908 to study Morris. During his return voyage, he met Leach's friend Reginald Turvey, and through Turvey, he met Leach in Tokyo. In a well-known incident in 1911, they went to a party together and attempted decorating rakuware, which was fired on the spot. That was the beginning of their career as potters. In 1912, they visited a colonial exhibition in Tokyo. It was packed with items from Japan's colonies at the time, from Taiwan, Manchuria, and Korea. There were also crafts from Okinawa and those of the native Ainu people in Hokkaido. According to Tomimoto, they were totally enchanted by those objects. He and Leach kept asking themselves why those uncivilized people had the power to produce such beautiful things, so much more beautiful than anything they could ever produce. This was the first recorded instance of a discussion on the particular beauty of folk wares, which would become the common focus of the Mingei network. Leach's and Tomimoto's early works are evidence of their attempts to achieve the quality of folk wares. And I apologize for the examples. I couldn't use better works. They sourced their models from Old English, European, and Middle Eastern pottery. With their creative practice outside Japan's traditional ceramic industry and its school system, they laid the foundation of modernity in Japanese ceramics. They exhibited their works together with their friends' paintings and crafts. Their works inspired many artists, and among them were the young Hamada Shoji and Kawai Kanjiro. A few years later, Leach moved to China, where in 1916 he met Langdon Warner. Of course, he was a bit younger. Warner was a Bostonian and a Harvard graduate. He first worked at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, under Okakura Kakuzo, the author of the famed The Book of Tea. Okakura was an advisor to the Asian art section of the museum at the time, and he sent Warner to Japan, where he studied early Japanese Buddhist sculpture. At the time of meeting Leach in China, Warner was a field agent for Cleveland Museum of Art. They found a shared interest in ceramics and folk arts, delighting in selecting and buying shadow puppet figures. It appears that Warner, who had traveled to China, Korea, and Japan, filled Leach in on the dynamic cultural transmission within a wider East Asia. Excuse me. Later in that year, Leach returned to Japan and, at Yanagi's invitation, built a kiln on Yanagi's property in Abiko, outside Tokyo. He continued his quest for the beauty of folk pottery and discussed it with Yanagi. As I mentioned, Hamada was inspired by the works of Leach and Tomimoto. He had studied ceramics at an industrial school, then at Kyoto Ceramic Testing Institute. But he found in Leach something deeper that he wanted to learn, and decided to accompany Leach when he returned to Britain in 1920. After settling in St. Ives, Leach continued his pursuit, this time with Hamada. Leach recalled how he and Hamada pondered on the aesthetic qualities of folk and early ceramics that were not found in modern or industrial products. Leach wrote, I quote, "We endlessly discussed all the aspects of potting, and we admired what is in folk art and nowhere else," unquote. They tried to approach such quality in their own work by, unquote, "applying to pots an appreciation of nature, of the natural effects of raw materials," unquote. One attempt was to revive the lost technique of English slipware. Their efforts were noticed by a visitor to their exhibition in 1921. It was Henry Bergen, a scholar of European classics working as an editor at the British Museum. Bergen became their close friend and a frequent visitor to St. Ives. Bergen had a strong interest in Eastern culture, especially of Japan. It seems that he became Leach's good companion in intellectual conversation. Bergen took up pottery himself, and when Leach received news of his friends in Japan, he shared it with Bergen. Now, the Great Kanto earthquake struck Tokyo in 1923, and Hamada returned to Japan early the following year. Tokyo was devastated, so he went to stay with his friend Kawai Kanjiro in Kyoto. Yanagi also moved to Kyoto. Yanagi and Hamada renewed the dialogue on the beauty of humble wares, now with Kawai, and the three men forsook Kyoto markets to find special pieces, and eventually they coined the word Mingei to describe them. Yanagi was a religious philosopher. He had been part of the group of young writers and artists, the Peasant School graduates whom Leach met soon after his arrival. The group published a magazine of literature and art in 1910 and introduced Western arts. They wrote on Rodin, Gauguin, Van Gogh, Cézanne, and so on. William Morris, John Ruskin, and William Blake, as well as William James, the Harvard philosopher and psychologist, were also in Yanagi's orbit. Armed with his knowledge of Western and Eastern philosophy, religion, and art, Yanagi contemplated on the beauty of folk and pre-modern objects. Why are they beautiful? What are their characteristics? And wrote his famous treatise, The Way of Craft. There are some of the pages from the book. As you can see, he took examples from around the world to argue his point. The top left, for example, is an illustration of Caxton's Aesop's Fables. In other words, The Way of Craft was intended to be his contribution to the worldwide art. His main points are that these objects are beautiful because they were made for everyday use. They were made by ordinary working people. The makers were unconscious of the beauty they were creating. They were made of natural local material. They were made in large numbers and quickly. They are products of people working together. Shortly after Yanagi formed his treatise in 1928, Landon Warner, who was now curator of Folk Museum at Harvard, traveled to Korea with his wife Lorraine, and also with Yanagi. Lorraine was a Korean ceramic expert. In Korea, she greatly benefited from the archaeological research that had been conducted by two Japanese brothers, Asakawa Noritaka and Takumi, who were living and working in Korea. Some years earlier, Yanagi and the Asakawas had raised funds to establish the Korean People's Art Museum in Seoul. Yanagi and the Asakawas had raised funds to establish the Korean People's Art Museum in Seoul. Sorry. So I was repeating the line. When Warner saw the display of Korean ceramics at the museum, he commented, and I quote, "To see these choice pieces arranged in their native setting is to receive a singularly vivid impression of the spirit of the country during those years," unquote. Warner invited Yanagi to the Folk Museum and to teach his course in Asian art at Harvard for the following year. At the Folk, he worked with Yanagi to hold an exhibition of u.s.a, souvenir paintings from Soetsu region near Kyoto, and published Yanagi's illustrated essay in his magazine, Eastern Arts. Warner's love of folk art remained throughout his life. He pushed the idea in 1939 in the form of an ambitious exhibition, Pacific Cultures, at the Golden Gate International Exposition, as a part of its 5 art exhibitions. In the catalogue, Warner quotes Eric Gill's words, I quote, "The things which men have made are inevitably the best witness. They cannot lie, and what they say is of supreme importance, for they speak of man's soul and they show who are his gods," unquote. The Japan section of the exhibition included a display called Peasant Art, consisting of 50 pieces, mostly borrowed from Yanagi's folk craft museum in Tokyo. While Yanagi and Warner used words and objects to communicate the aesthetic, the potters Leach, Hamada, Kawai, and Tomimoto expressed their admiration for and inspiration from the beauty of humble objects, each in his own creative process. Among them, Hamada's work appears to embody the aesthetic most directly. In his conversation with Leach in the 1970s, oops, sorry, I forgot to show this. This was the part of the Warner's Japanese peasant art display. So this is the Hamada's. The three terms that are core of Mingei, health, naturalness, and beauty, are the core around which all my friends developed. This is true Mingei from my point of view. This is the definition of Mingei. All of my friends, including Kawai, knew this from the inside and therefore never actually moved away from it. Not only that, they went on to develop individually without colliding with each other. Hamada commented on Kawai here because his opinion on Kawai's work differs from that of Yanagi's. Yanagi was never comfortable with Kawai's individualistic style and often voiced his reservations for what he thought was his over-expressiveness. But Hamada could see the fundamental naturalness in Kawai's work. Tomimoto once wrote at length this immense power of this Ming dish, which is now in the Japan Folkcraft Museum collection. But instead of trying to approach such quality in his work, he aimed at competing against it with his own individual expression. So the next I just talk about a potter's work, the potter's book. To the world outside the Mingei network, Leach was first and foremost the acclaimed author of A Potter's Book. Its first outstanding feature would be the extensive scope of the illustrated examples, everything from an ancient Persian jar, English medieval pictures to Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and English old and contemporary works is packed into this small book. Technical explanations also match the scope. In other words, the book is as intercultural as the practice of pottery itself. But its most significant content is the first section called Towards the Standards, in which Leach provides criteria of aesthetic values for pottery. In an earlier book of ceramic techniques, a British potter, Charles Binns, wrote, "Art appreciation is the most subtle thing, and no one may dictate his neighbor as to what he should or should not admire." Binns, by the way, became an inaugural head of the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University. But Leach believed that it was his mission to tell people what they should admire. For this purpose, Yanagi, the philosopher, provided his highly sophisticated arguments, which Leach extensively quotes in the book. Whether one agrees with this particular aesthetic or not, it set a level of discernment and provided a vocabulary to express it. In the context of Mingei network, this book is a collaboration. Leach pulled together Yanagi's aesthetic arguments, the technical tips and experience of his potter friends Hamada, Tomimoto, Kawai, and his teacher Kenzan, along with those from Western traditions and his colleagues. Henry Bergen edited this book, not only with his hands-on knowledge of techniques as a potter, but also with his uncompromising professional standard of editing. Leach's biographer Emmanuel Cooper gives a fascinating account of the editing process involving Leach, Bergen, and the publisher. Bergen, who was the oldest of the group, suffered from shingles while working on the book, and he died a decade later, 1950. So now I want to just talk a little about their trips to the United States. The Mingei aesthetic was at the root of Leach's approach to his pottery, but it was his practice as a modern studio potter that was the inspiration to many. As stated in the Leach Pottery website, by showing the direction for the emerging studio pottery, he played a crucial pioneering role in creating an identity for artist potters across the world. Leach's first trip to the United States was by invitation of the Institute of Contemporary Art in Washington, D.C. The director, Robert Richmond, was a poet and art critic. Richmond was an admirer of Herbert Reed and inspired particularly by Reed's education through art. He founded the Institute of Contemporary Art to bring art and culture to the nation's capital. Richmond believed in the interrelatedness of all arts and conducted a wide range of art programs: poetry, music, performing, and visual arts. Richmond's idea of the true artist was someone who intuitively learns from the best of the art of the past rather than follow academic rules, and in whom a unity of religion, government, philosophy, and aesthetics existed. So he obviously saw these qualities in Leach and decided to invite him. Leach agreed, and they began to organize his itinerary. That was late 1949. During his visit to the U.S. From February 1950, Leach rekindled friendships with expert British artists and also Langdon Warner. He also made many new friends. The blue stars here indicate where he visited in 1950, starting from East Coast, the West and the Midwest, and went back to East Coast and then to the West Coast. The East Coast venues were organized by individuals attached to institutions. In contrast, the West Coast venues were largely planned by leading potters in a much more flexible manner through what is called ceramic grapevine, stretching throughout California. Initially, Leach did not plan to travel to the West Coast, although Warner suggested that he did, writing to him, and quote, "California has more and better potters than we have in the East, and they all have your book," unquote. Warner's comment was echoed by Richard Patterson of Scripps College, Claremont, who wrote to Richmond, and quote, "Everyone in ceramic work here has read his unique Potter's book and looks upon it as the finest book ever written on the subject, and was already been thoroughly sold on Bernard Leach as leader and teacher." 2 weeks before his scheduled departure, Leach decided to include the West Coast in his itinerary so that he could spend time with his close friend Mark Tobey in Seattle. This was because his plan to meet with Tobey in Chicago had fallen through. The news of Leach's visit delighted the West Coast ceramic grapevine, and the prominent potters put their heads together to plan his schedule. Leach was to visit Los Angeles and San Francisco, but the presentation ceremony of the Binns Medal required his presence in New York in April, so the visit to Southern California had to be canceled. The potters decided that Mills College in Oakland had the best facilities for Leach, who conducted a 2-week workshop and also gave lectures around the area. 2 years later, in 1952, Leach returned to the United States with the Hamada Shoji and the Yanagi Soetsu. Hamada and the Yanagi were well known through Leach's A Potter's Book, so many potters were eager to see them. The main purpose of the trip was to report on the International Conference of Craftsmen in Pottery and Textiles, held in July at Dartington, England, with Leach as one of the organizers. So during their trip across America, Leach and the Yanagi largely repeated their presentations at the conference. Oops. Oh, so I forgot to show you the images. So this is Leach demonstrating at Mills College, 1950. And this was taken at the Dartington during the international conference. Bernard Leach invited Yanagi and Hamada as to represent the East. So during this trip across America, they repeated mainly Leach and Yanagi repeated their talks at the conference, and red dots or stars indicate where they stopped for workshops, lectures, and demonstrations. In Boston, the 3 men stayed at the Warner's, which became their last meeting. Warner died 3 years later. Leach organized 2-week workshops on East Coast, Midwest, and West Coast. The East Coast venue was at the Black Mountain College, where Marguerite Wildenhain was invited from Pond Farm in California to host their workshop. Wildenhain had been a vocal opponent of Leach's position in regards to the direction to be taken by the modern studio potters. The argument started when Leach, after his first trip, published an article about his impressions of American pottery practice, in which he lamented the lack of tradition, or what he called taproot. Wildenhain, who was trained at Bauhaus, on the other hand, saw an immense potential in the individual artist of this new country and objected to his position. There was a lively discussion at the Dartington conference, and their arguments continued at the Black Mountain College. The 2-week workshop program at the 3 locations consisted of demonstrations of pottery making, decorating, and firing. Between those sessions, there were lectures, discussions, and film screening. These topics included the standards of the aesthetic quality of work, need for science, and the position of handicrafts in the age of mechanical production, among other things. Yanagi's talks were built around his Mingei theory, the beauty found in everyday objects that were produced without conscious efforts of the maker to create beauty. He supported his points with the color slides of objects which he had selected with a discerning eye. Some of the examples, but please note that these images may not necessarily be from those Yanagi showed at the time. So I just pulled them up from the Japan Folkcraft Museum website, and they have a very good selection, beautiful selection of objects. The 3 men were able to visit Los Angeles area this time, and Richard Peterson, Susan Peterson, and others organized their 2-week workshop over the 2 venues. At the Schoener's workshop, and that's the very well-known image of Hamada at Scripps College. And Richard Peterson splitted the venues, the 2-week venues, between the 2 institutions. Susan Peterson's meeting with Hamada at this time was the beginning of a long friendship, which led to her book Shoji Hamada, A Potter's Way and Work. On their last day at the Scripps, they gave an evening lecture, film screening of pottery making in Mashiko village where Hamada lived, and a demonstration at the Los Angeles County Museum. According to reports, despite heavy rain that night, more than 1,200 people gathered to witness the event, and most of them are potters, and the session lasted until midnight. After Los Angeles, they went up to Northern California, where again Mills College hosted lectures, film, and demonstration. They made an appearance at the San Francisco Museum of Art and other venues, and reconnected with friends and formed new friendships. They also visited the Wildenhains at Pond Farm. In January 1953, they flew to Hawaii, where they spent a few weeks and also lecturing, but mostly relaxing, before flying back to Japan. So what was the significance of their physical appearance before the American audiences in those trips? Leach's impact on American potters has been discussed by many, many people, and I'm not going to repeat here. But I'd like to point out the importance of his sincere personality in communicating his points. It seems that he was able to focus on the greater good without letting his ego interfere. With his relationship with Wildenhain too, despite their differences in opinion, his respect for her abilities remained. Yanagi brought his seeing eye and the vocabulary to express it. He demonstrated discerning eye through images of his collection and provided rich descriptions and analysis of their beauty. In so doing, he urged the audience to pay attention to humble objects of use. For many, it was an eye-opening experience, a revelation, and they felt empowered that they too could see beauty in those objects. To support his claim, Yanagi brought in Japan's long tradition of the tea practitioner's connoisseurship in seeing beauty in everyday objects. Hamada, for his part, let Leach and Yanagi do the talking and opted to sit at the wheel and quietly worked with his clay. The audience witnessed how the pots were born, not made, in Yanagi's words. So this way, the three men made a powerful combination. The impact of their presence was described by one of the attendees. Dr. Yanagi's and Bernard Leach's penetrating words were exemplified in their showing of colored slides images of the art of the people Mingei. Their lectures on the nature of beauty were powerfully reinforced by Shoji Hamada's demonstrations at the potter's wheel. So silent and productive was he that it was not until the end of the week that we realized that he too spoke perfect English. The author of this passage was Martha Longanecker, who attended the West Coast workshop and later founded the Mingei International Museum in San Diego. Naturally, the audience's impression varied according to the individual. Longanecker closely followed Yanagi's theory and taught it to her students, while others ingested Leach's and Hamada's approach to making their own way. So as conclusion, in my investigation, I found that global Mingei originated in the network of those individuals who shared the taste and the discriminating eye for simple and healthy objects of folk and ancient art. They considered these arts as representations of the spirituality of the people as a whole, as opposed to expressions of individual creativity. In the context of Western art, their idea was partly rooted in the arts and crafts philosophy. Leach, Tomimoto, and Yanagi were familiar with William Morris's idea and practice, and Eric Gill joined dialogue with all of the Mingei network protagonists. From this point of view, we may understand the global Mingei as a regeneration of arts and crafts in the modern world where people and information spread globally. While arts and crafts lacked a direct discourse on beauty, Mingei added its aesthetic of health, naturalness, beauty. And Yanagi elaborated and articulated this aesthetic, while Hamada and other studio potters who followed his example implicitly expressed it in their work. And it is this aesthetic that identifies Mingei within a larger stream of arts and craft tradition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chiaki. Your talk really strongly indicates how the Mingei movement was a bridge between the arts and crafts movement and the studio craft movement as well. Thank you so much. We're going to dive into some of the questions, and there are several. And so to begin, Brent Johnson had emailed us a question asking if you can elaborate on how the definition of Mingei has evolved since Dartington Hall in 1952 to take on the much wider definition you refer to as global Mingei.
How long have we got? Well, Yanagi actually did not talk about the Mingei at Dartington. So as my research sort of progressed, I realized that Yanagi was constantly discussing and defending Mingei in Japan, but outside, his sort of main purpose was to advocate the beauty without really explaining what Mingei is and so forth. Does that answer your question? So it's not so much Mingei actually evolved, but our understanding of Mingei probably evolved more.
Okay, thank you.
That doesn't make sense.
I will invite everyone to also, we will try to cover as many questions as we can. You're also welcome to email us at rsvp@craftinamerica.org, any additional questions, and we will put you in contact with Chiaki following the event. Continuing on, you have several questions from Kumiko Jacqueline. One starting out, I think is quite interesting. How do you describe the paradox of the fame versus Leach's book title? Despite Yanagi's book title, The Unknown Craftsman, all Mingei potters became famous, and the original members also being designated national treasures and so on. That's a great.
That's a very the vexing question. If you look at it from everything from Yanagi's point of view, and try to understand Mingei only from Yanagi's definition, and that's where I found it much more sort of inclusive, but to realize that Yanagi's definition was only part of the Mingei story when the whole idea of Mingei was formed among those people and within their conversation. So in other words, what I also try to initially understand the Mingei from Yanagi's definition, and then you, of course, come across all this dilemma or contradictions of like supposed to be famous famous people are also included in Yanagi's definition, and that problem persists in Japan as well, and among the Mingei, so-called Mingei people. But from when you actually look at how the whole idea of Mingei evolved among those people and shared and what it was, and Yanagi's theory was only part of it, or his contribution to it, and that to me explains the dilemma much better.
Thank you. Another excellent question, Carol Weiner. Were there women who practiced Mingei? And
Oh, yes.
that also is probably were involved in the original origins. I know you talked about Peterson and Margaret Wildenhain's involvement and connection.
Yes,
but.
yes, and also the Merit, Ethel Merritt, the textile artist at Ditchling, she became very good the friends of Hamada and Yanagi. Hamada discovered her the cloth, and he had a suit made and he wore it for years and years. And Yanagi and Hamada also introduced her work to Japan. And I understand they would have discussed quite a lot. And I remember, who was it? Was it and the Leach? I think said Leach had the whole Koge magazine, which Yanagi and the Mingei people published from 1931, and the Ethel Merritt, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Well, she wanted all the Yanagi to send her all the issues that featured textile. And so she was in discussion with Leach. But of course, it's all those talks, the flies on the wall have long gone, and we don't really know what was talked about. But from bits, we could sort of imagine what they would have discussed. Can you, I sort of lost you, Emily.
Oh, I'm right here, yes.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Thank you for those answers. From Ted Bosley, he is wondering if you're aware if Hamada and Yanagi came into contact with Sissoko Tsune, who was a student.
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes, oh, yes, definitely. It's just I'm afraid I couldn't talk more about the trips, but the Sissoko Tsune was studying English at that time in California, in Pasadena, and she interpreted for them while they were in California. And also Sissoko Tsune became a very close friend of Martha Longaneka, and she's informed her a lot about Japanese culture and helped her before Longaneka finally made to Japan, which was not until Yanagi died.
Okay, great. He also asked about Ruth Asawa, Jade Snow Wong, and whether they passed through Carmel when they were here. I'm sorry. Should I repeat that?
Yes, please.
Did they come in contact with Ruth Asawa and Jade Snow Wong, and did they pass through Carmel?
I don't think they went to pass through the Carmel. I didn't come across the name, and I didn't come across the other names either. Sorry, the people.
Great.
And if you know, if you have any evidence, no, please let me know. I'm still collecting more information. Thank you.
And again, I'm happy to pass along information. We will put everyone in touch since it's hard to do this virtually.
Thank you.
He also asked if Yanagi was aware of the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a subject of interest for Blake and James.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes. He read extensively, and I think, yeah, I think so in some of the studies, Yanagi had a very extensive knowledge of Western philosophers and those writings. what was the yes, sorry, the short answer is yes.
Great. R. Small asks if you could talk about their discovery of Maria Martinez and impact that it had on Pueblo and Native American pottery.
But I don't know about the impact they had on the American pottery, but yes, apparently Hamada had known about Maria Martinez's work before he actually went to the States. And when he was young, I think he's in his writing. So, and of course, I couldn't touch on their visit to Santa Fe and the meeting with the Maria Martinez. It was a famous story that Susan Peterson writes about, and there's a photo of the three people with Maria Martinez in her book on Maria. And when they had a presentation at the museum in Santa Fe, Maria Martinez came.
I believe we are frozen. We will give it a moment. We just lost you for a moment. If you could repeat what you were saying just for the last 30 seconds or so.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, I just didn't have time to talk about their visit to Santa Fe. In general, the three were sort of lamenting, as Leach did, the lack of the tradition, but they were delighted by all the Native American crafts, and that's why I think they also wanted to visit Santa Fe and that area. And both Yanagi and Leach wrote how delighted they were, and Leach wrote that Yanagi and Hamada spent all the money that they had earned from lecturing things buying Native American crafts in Santa Fe. And when they had they did a demonstration in Santa Fe and presentations that Maria Martinez came, and also Georgia O'Keeffe also came.
Let's see. Lauren Deutsch asks about how you see a distinct trend in the development and appreciation of Korean art since the end of the colonial period. And I think you started to talk about the ways that Korean art came into play in the formation of Mingei, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit.
Yes, that's another the big topic. And because there have been so many people writing specifically about the Korean art and the Mingei, I don't really touch that. But of course, that was what the Yanagi, that inspired first Yanagi to those humble objects and so-called unknown craftsmen. The beauty of those wares was that was in 1914, I think, when he was presented the Korean white porcelain piece by Asakawa Noritaka, when Asakawa visited Yanagi to see the three small Rodin sculpture pieces that Yanagi had. Well, not so much he had it, but his group had it, and so Asakawa wanted to see them, and as a kind of introduction, like the present. So Yanagi was very much taken by this beauty, and that was the start, it is said, of his fascination with Korea. And since then, of course, he went to visited Korea many times, and his wife Kaneko, who was the vocal artist, she held concerts to raise funds to build museums. And yes, the Korean art, but also Okinawan art as well, had a very important impact on the whole development of Mingei.
Great. We're at 2 o'clock, but we'll take a couple more of these questions. We have time, and I know there will be more. So again, please feel free to email us, those, and we will continue the conversation off live. I wanted to mention, first of all, that this is recorded, and so we will be posting it on craftinamerica.org and on our YouTube channel, so people can view it in perpetuity. And I wanted to thank our sponsors, the California Arts Council and the City of LA Department of Cultural Affairs and Los Angeles County Department of Arts and Culture for their support. And I also just wanted to briefly mention that we have another Zoom discussion happening next Friday at 12 on textiles for Textile Month with Textile Art Los Angeles, and that will be Jim Bassler and Carol Shaw Sutton speaking. And then the following weekend, Saturday the 12th, we have another You Know Me related event with Jenny Sorkin and the 2 guest curators of the Here Now exhibition, Katie Queen and Nikki Lewis. So let's see, another question. Hal Higginbotham says, can you talk about Mingei in its historical political context? Yanagi and the others were also reacting to political concerns.
Oh, well, that's, I think, there is such a big topic to have now. And again, in terms of political, their involvement or positions, I think Kikuchi Yuko and that's her book discusses that, and also the Kim, sorry, that's just the name, Kim Brandt's, her book on Yanagi and the Mingei movement also discuss quite extensively on the political side of the activities. I just leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Yes, topic. Joe Laurie asks, she says she was told by Potter Ruth Rippon that she and Peter Volkus attended a lecture and demo by the trio at Mills. Is there documentation that?
That's the sorry, Montana, is that Archie Bray Foundation. That was the demonstration. I think that's when the Peter Volkus turned the wheel for Hamada, and that was the yeah. There's
nothing at Mills College though.
Not Mills College, I don't think. So yeah, because they went to also they were invited to by Archie Bray to spend about a week there, and they made it. They gave a lecture and demonstration there.
Mm-hmm.
Documentation. I've only seen the subletters that was at the Archives American Art. And oh, not sorry, it wasn't archive. Oh, yeah. And sorry, I just escaped my mind where those documents are, but not in a big published way, I don't think. But I'll have a look, and I'll just take a note. And it was so interesting, the whole story of that demonstration as well. Okay. Mm-hmm. Particularly on that impact on Peter Volkus.
Exactly. Yeah. as we conclude, one of the last questions, which is also maybe large, but leaders using the qualities of Mingei in the art world today. How do you feel about that?
Sorry, what? Could you repeat that? Yeah.
Who you feel is using the qualities of Mingei in the art world today?
Well, I can't say. I don't know. That's the short answer. I don't know everybody's work, and particularly now, I think it is important to look globally. And I'm not that very informed, but I'm just what I did with my research is just to have the base on where it all started. So I'm just leaving the other scholars and the Potter's practitioners to find their own what is relevant to them.
While it does also, yeah, there's clearly so many questions coming through in addition that we won't be able to address today, but I do want to mention that all of this research that you've been gathering over this decade plus is gearing towards a book that will be forthcoming, and that you're in the process of seeking a publisher for all of this. And clearly, we all would very much like to see that happen. So we will stay tuned for updates on that front from you. I think we will adjourn at this point. So again, anyone, we will try to gather all of the comments from the chat and share them with Chiaki, and everyone is welcome to email us so that we can put you in contact as well. rsvp@craftinamerica.org. And thank you again so much for this incredible talk today. We appreciate it. Thank you for the early morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.